I'm George from Ireland. Welcome back to my channel once again. Relations between Russia and Iran seem more cordial than ever, but there is a limit to just how amicable they can be. But I'll come on to that part later. Anyway, obviously, Russia's been hit by a very extensive range of sanctions since February this year, 2022. About 8 rounds of European Union sanctions from the United States, the UK, South Korea, all sorts of countries. Now, Iran has been under sanctions since 2010, with a brief hiatus at the end of the Obama administration. So Russia's been forced to look for alternative trade partners because they're managing to do very little commerce with Western countries, trying to find means to circumvent the sanctions. And Iran is one of the countries trying to help them do that. But of course, Iran, under sanctions itself, often can't get access to the goods that Russia wants. So Iran has been selling kamikaze drones to the Russian army. There's absolutely irrefragable evidence of that. The Iranian regime and the Russian regime both denying it, which is proof positive that it is happening. Anyway, now Iran has just come out and acknowledged that they did sell drones to Russia, but they insisted that was only before the 2022 war. Now, it could be that they sold them in previous years. I don't find that hard to believe. What I do find hard to believe is that they suddenly stopped selling them. Sometimes in the United Nations, abstained, never voted against Russia. Anyway, so far as we know, that's the limit of their joint projects. But there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity between the two countries. There have never been so many meetings between high-ranking functionaries from Russia and Iran. And our President Vladimir Putin, he visited Tehran early this year. I think I'm correct in saying that's the only time he's ever visited that country, or indeed that any Russian leader has visited the country since 1943, the Tehran Conference, and that wasn't to meet the Iranian leaders, that was to meet FDR and Winston Churchill. Now, admittedly, the Russian leader back then was actually Georgian, leader of the Soviet Union. Anyway, so there have been plenty of talk about how to get around these Western sanctions, and these meetings are really more discursive than actually reaching solid conclusions, because both countries find that their ability to get around these sanctions is severely hampered. But the Russian regime likes to show its audience at home that Russia is not friendless. Notwithstanding the best endeavors of the Occident, Russia still has allies somewhere. But ally be too strong a word. The Iranians are not actually fighting for Russia, but your enemy is my enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. That's the way it goes. They're both anti-Western regimes. And should the West succeed in saving Ukraine, then that would bode ill for Iran. Iran would think that Occidental morale will be buoyed up. They would say, well, we can really contain Iran. Now, obviously, the comparison shouldn't be drawn too far. Iran is not illegally occupying the land of another country. And they're backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen, that's true. And obviously they're in Syria, fighting at the behest of the Syrian regime, barbarous though it is. Under international law, that is the recognized government of Syria. And they have their pro-Iranian militias in Lebanon and Iraq. So they have quite a lot of sway across the Middle East. They got the Hazaras, that Shia minority in Afghanistan, they're backing up. So Gazprom is the Russian state gas giant, and they were promising to invest a very tiny sum of $40 billion in the Iranian oil and gas sector. But the trouble is, Iran has great difficulty selling this country. I mean, India and Pakistan will buy it, but a lot of countries won't. And I've been saying this since the beginning of the war. If Western countries simply lift sanctions in Iran, that'd get a lot of oil and gas back onto the market and drop the price. You might say, but the Iranians don't want to upset their Russian friends. Well, their friendship only goes so far. You've got to put your self-interest before your friendship with the country, which has actually not really done you any good turns. So Russia is seeking to purchase vehicles, spare parts of vehicles, planes, and so on from Iran, because Russia's automotive industries and aeronautical industries have been severely harmed by not being able to buy spare parts. Not that Iran produces great vehicles or planes. Anyway, there are more flights between Russia and Iran than ever before. trade between the two countries is meant to reach $6 billion this year, but that would still be under 1% of Russia's foreign trade. Now, admittedly, as Russia's foreign trade is contracting and its trade with Iran is rising, maybe it's going to get to 2% of Russia's foreign trade just because it's doing less trade, just because most countries will not trade with Russia as much as they used to. But yeah, it's still tiny. Take Turkey, a NATO country, and Russia's already doing $30 billion worth of trade with Turkey, probably due to increase because NATO's the only, Turkey is the only NATO nation not to have imposed any trade restrictions on Russia whatsoever. So anyway, we can't be too optimistic about things. Iran's civil aviation industry is nothing to write home about, but it might keep some Russian planes airworthy a little bit longer. Iranian car manufacturing is not world renowned, and indeed the government said they're going to stop making certain models because they're terrible on fuel efficiency. They have a bad safety record. They're dreadful for the environment. They're relatively expensive compared to imports from places like India. Anyway, but Iran could make up for what Russia can't get. There's a gap in the market. Hi, Diablo Blue, I'm doing well. For things like cement, bricks, anything for construction, some heavy goods, engineering items. Tehran suffers a number of problems. They don't have enough hard currency. They might have to be able to accept payment in Russian rubles. Will the Russians accept Iranian rials, which are not very valuable, not easily exchangeable? Is there going to do some sort of straightforward barter deal between them? Now, the Russians, they built the Bushehr nuclear plant in Iran, but as of last year, that was over $500 billion cost, and it still hasn't been paid. They built that years ago. So the Russians are meant to lend money, lend $5 billion to be precise, to build the Sirik power plant and to upgrade Iranian railways to electrify them. But Russia might not lend this money because it mightn't consider it worth it, that they're just not going to get it back. And Russia's in no position to argue, can scarcely afford to alienate Iran. But then again, Iran can't really afford to alienate Russia. Who's Iran friendly with? I mean, China to some extent, North Korea. There used to be European countries back in the 80s, like Yugoslavia and Romania had quite good relations with them. Almost nobody does, Venezuela. So Russia's sort of casting around for regimes which are friendly to them. They got maybe Nicaragua, Venezuela, even Cuba didn't vote their way in the United Nations, Eritrea, Iran, Syria, North Korea, and that's about it. Others, even China, voted to be neutral. There might be a few other African countries which vote to be neutral. So it doesn't have any significant power, so actually going to vote their way. And other countries are worried of secondary sanctions, so they start re-exporting things to Russia. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So a country, I'll buy something that Russia's not allowed, and then I'll sell it on to Russia, which is illegal, and risk sanctions myself. So Russia would like to increase its political clout, but Russia's inattention to the Middle East is glaring. They say almost nothing about Syria. They don't have the troops. They don't have the money to spare for anything else. They've had to withdraw some of their Wagner mercenaries from African, Middle Eastern countries. Anyway, the Iranian regime is actually quite brittle. I don't think it's going to be overthrown. But Iran could face some sort of crisis, some sort of hyperinflation that's rising, rising crime, taxes on the increase, the infrastructure is creaking. There was that young woman who's murdered for not wearing a headscarf, and there've been mass protests. Dozens of people have been killed by the authorities. The Iranians have had to close down people meeting in public spaces. A lot of wealthy young Iranians have gone abroad, are studying abroad. These are liberal people. They haven't been cut off from the world. They know what's happening. They've got the internet, and they want change, and they're frustrated. And that revolution was, my goodness, 43 years ago, is wound down. And yeah, there are a few headbangers who believe in it, reactionaries, particularly in the countryside, religious maniacs. But obviously your average Iranian is a bit more liberal than that. Not quite liberal in the Western terms, but maybe liberal in Middle Eastern terms. And admittedly, the Iranians I meet abroad, they're at the extreme end of liberalism, so they don't typify the Iranian population. Anyway, there is some resentment in Iran against Russia. They haven't forgotten that Russia occupied some of their territory, and so on. Russia's got a reasonable relationship with Azerbaijan. Iran's got quite a cordial relationship with Turkey, partly because they fear, a cordial relationship with Armenia. Their relationship with Turkey is fractious. They fear the Azerbaijanis claiming 2/3 of historically was Azerbaijan, which is part of Iran these days. Anyway, so opinion polls prove that public opinion in Iran is much less positive towards Russia than it used to be after the invasion of Ukraine. We could be next. We could be invaded by them. You know, Russia was very friendly with Ukraine in the 90s, and look what happened. They attempted to murder their president. They've tried to meddle in their elections, to falsify their elections. They've invaded them. They could do the same to us. So there have even been some pro-Ukrainian demonstrations in Iran. So anyway, if signing some sort of big deal with Russia might provoke backlash in Iran. So even cooperation with China is not terribly popular, and it's difficult because obviously China is an ally of Pakistan. Pakistan and Iran don't have the best relationship. It's not terrible, but that 10% of Pakistanis, maybe 20% of Pakistanis are Shias. They're often discriminated against. They're often murdered, and Iran feels for them, and so on. So Pakistan and Iran are back at opposite sides in the Afghan civil war. So anyway, the Iranians can teach the Russians how to mitigate the impact of sanctions, but you can't avoid it altogether. It's going to hurt. So you can negate it somewhat. So Iranian gross domestic product is about where it was in 2010 when the sanctions started. It shrank, it grew, and they've stagnated really. It proves that a regime can't survive these sanctions. Now Russia's much bigger than Iran in terms of population, well, about double. In terms of territory, far bigger. Maybe more clout. It's already got nuclear weapons. But yeah, so that's what the other thing I pointed out is these sanctions are not going to be enough to topple this Putin regime. So although they have a quite good cooperative relationship, there's a limit to how fruitful it can be for both of them. They both got not that much to offer each other. Selling some low-grade weapons, that may be the extent of it. Iran could be a troublemaker in the Middle East to distract Western countries. Russia's been quite helpful because the Western focus is on the Ukraine situation, maybe taking the heat off Iran, something like that. Russia's also trying to have quite a good relationship with Saudi Arabia, who brokered the release of some Western prisoners who were captured by the Russians. But therefore, Russia dare not be too cozy with the Iranians for fear of putting Saudi Arabia's nose out of joint, and vice versa. So the Russians, they can't be too pally with the Saudi Arabians because that would irk Iran. So there's a delicate balancing act to be performed. Thank you so much for watching my channel. Please subscribe on Patreon, donate on PayPal. Goodbye.